Hello, welcome to our online Pastor's Bible Study for June 24th, 2020. Tonight we're going to be doing a deep dive into Psalm 121 as we continue to explore the theme of songs of summer. Last week we looked at the very first song in the Bible's songbook of Psalms. Today we're going to open our Bibles to Psalm 121, which is a little closer to the end of the book of Psalms. During the summer, many families like to take car trips. When I was growing up, and also when my kids were growing up, one of the things we would often do when we were driving somewhere, especially if it was a long drive, we would sing together. We would sing camp songs and we would sing hymns. With my kids, we would sing certain John Prine songs too that they'd grown up with. The reason I share that is because Psalm 121 is classified as a song of ascent. Okay, and this is going to make more sense in a second. It's the second of 14 songs of ascent that can be found in Psalms 120 through Psalm 134. Now, these psalms were used by ancient Jews whenever they would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, whenever they would go on a trip, kind of like Jesus and the disciples did whenever they would go to Jerusalem for some reason, like when they went that last week for Passover. The pilgrims would sing this song as they ascended into the holy city and into the temple. Psalm 121 has also been called a psalm for sojourners. Even today, some families will recite Psalm 121 just before they begin a trip, which is something maybe you'll want to think about doing sometime when you're going somewhere or when you're traveling with your family. Of course, you don't have to travel anywhere for this song to speak to you. I know it's a favorite psalm for many of our folks. Life itself is a journey, and sometimes things can get difficult along the way. Psalm 121 asks the question, when your world gets dark and scary, where do you turn for help? What is your source of confidence and trust? The psalmist has an answer to that question, and he wants you to find that answer too. As always, I'm going to be reading a verse or two, and then I'll be pausing to share with you some of the things I've learned along the way. So we're going to begin at verse 1. I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where will my help come? In Hebrew, the action of lifting the eyes implies looking at something with longing or desire. The hills here are likely the mountains of Zion, which the psalmist would have seen as he made his way to Jerusalem in the distance. Of course, a journey like that was filled with dangers. Sometimes the hills could also be a place where thieves hid, where bandits hid. Likewise, life itself is filled with dangers. There are physical dangers and economic dangers and spiritual dangers too. What more natural question to ask than from where will my help come in the midst of all of these dangers? And of course, the psalmist answers his own question with a confession of faith in verse 2. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. The psalmist doesn't look to other people. He doesn't look to weapons or to anything that this world has to offer. The psalmist's help comes from the very one who made heaven and earth and everything in it. The psalmist describes God with two different labels here, as my help and as the maker of heaven and earth. Of course, these two aspects of God's character are found in other places in the Old Testament, but something I learned this week is that it's only in Psalm 121 and Psalm 124, both of which are songs of ascent, that these two images are found together. So in both cases, God is seen as the powerful creator of all things, but also as one who is concerned about the well-being of a single person. The psalmist says, my help comes from the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth. But interestingly enough, you're going to see that the pronouns shift. This is something I'd never noticed before either. Psalm 121 begins with first person pronouns, my and I, and then it shifts to second person pronouns in verse 3, you and your, from that point on. In other words, the speaker goes from confession at the beginning to blessing others. Some interpreters imagine that when this song was used in the temple, maybe in temple worship, the priest leading the song or the worship would have taken over in verse 3 when it says, He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. So the psalmist is assuring believers here that God will guard and protect the faithful, allowing them to continue in their service, allowing them to stand no matter what might happen. In the second part of verse 3, the psalmist assures us that the one who watches over us does not slumber. That idea then is again repeated in the next verse. Now, something I learned this week that was interesting, I actually knew some of this already, was that other ancient religions believed that their gods needed rest and sleep, just like people. You might remember the story of Elijah when he took on the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18. And if you've never read that story, you might want to pause and go and read that story. It's a great story, just pretty much all of chapter 18 in 1 Kings. At one point, Elijah, who's doing this kind of a test with these priests, he begins to tease them that maybe their God isn't responding because their God's fallen asleep and needs to be woken up. So again, the psalmist repeats that idea of sleeping again in verse 4 when we read, "He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." The Creator God of Israel is one who watches over his people at all the time. And there are actually two Hebrew words here that are used for sleep. The word that's translated as slumber refers to drowsiness or to light sleep. Somebody that might kind of nod off. Similar to what somebody might do on a Sunday morning, for instance, if they're sitting in a nice warm pew and they haven't got a very good night's rest the night before. The word that's translated as sleep here represents more what we think of as sleep, a deeper kind of rest. Using both of these words together, the psalmist again is reminding us that God never nods off. God is always at work, guiding and guarding those he loves. So he goes on in verse 5. "The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand." Now the psalm uses two more metaphors here to describe how God is our keeper in this verse. He says God is the shade at our right hand. Now I'd never really understood this right hand imagery very well until I dug into some commentaries on this week and learned some things. Apparently in ancient times, a soldier carried his shield in his left hand so that he could wield his weapon in his right hand. Well, that left the right side of his body basically exposed because there was no shield on this side. Well, that being the case, soldiers always wanted to have a friend or an ally on their right side to provide protection with their shield, which they would have been holding in their left hand. So the psalmist is saying here that God is the friend that we have at our right side, at our right hand, fending off those potential threats. This is, by the way, an image that is found only one time in the Bible, and it's found right here. The idea of God providing shade for believers, on the other hand, is an idea that does come up more often, and the psalmist takes that idea a step further in verse 6. "The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night." In this verse, we see an example of something that was fairly common in the way that Israelites thought and wrote. So by mentioning both the sun and the moon, it creates something called a merismus, which is when two kind of contrasting ideas are mentioned together in order to capture a sense of the whole. We see a similar thing at the very beginning of Genesis when the author describes the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Basically what that means is a knowledge of everything, the whole spectrum from good to evil. Today we might say from soup to nuts, or from A to Z, or something like that. The psalmist is saying that God watches over us when the sun's shining, when the moon is shining, day and night. He is our keeper, no matter when. And in the final two verses, in 7 and 8, the psalmist simply tells us again what he's already told us. Notice as you read these last two verses how many times the word keep comes up. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in. I think there's another merismus there too. Two contrasting ideas. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on and forevermore. The Hebrew word here that's translated as keep is shamar. It means to watch or to guard or to keep. The Bible, the psalmist uses this word to build to a kind of crescendo. There's no place we can go, he says. No time we can spend. Nothing that is beyond the reach of our God. God will guard your going and your coming day and night from this time on and forevermore. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that bad things won't sometimes happen to believers. The psalmist understood better than anyone that sometimes evil prospers. The wicked are able to achieve big things. And sometimes bad things happen to good people. But the psalmist understood that God is a spiritual help and guide in all things. God's love and peace is never far away. It's not uncommon, I understand, for Jewish families to post this psalm, Psalm 121, in their children's rooms as a kind of a blessing over them and a prayer of protection. Sometimes they'll even put it on their baby carriages. Again, it's a blessing and it's a reminder of God's day-to-day care for each and every one of us. I hope our Bible study has been as much of a blessing for you as it has been for me. Please plan to join me this Sunday as I explore this Song of Ascent a little bit more, and also find within it the good news of Jesus Christ, because that's always there. Don't forget, we will be resuming in-person worship at 9 and 11, not this Sunday, but next Sunday, on Sunday, July 5th. And if you have any questions, please feel free to call the church office during office hours any day. God bless, and thank you for joining me.